imagine you could be in the capital city, at home with your family. Armed men could essentially enter your home, sometimes without uniform, and drag you away in the Afar region, which is very desertous. It's called Awash Arba, known as Ethiopia's Guantanamo. Daily, yes. There isn't a day that goes by where an Amhara person isn't killed, isn't abused.
This is happening to Ethiopia's Amhara people, one of Africa's and one of Ethiopia's oldest indigenous communities. And yet, most of the world has no idea.
The Abiy regime is complicit in genocide. This is a major war, one of the largest in the African continent and in the world. We need to be talking about this.
ROBEL, thank you so much for being with us today. You are the Director of Communications and Senior Conflict Analyst at the Amhara Association of America, which is an NGO that's based in the US. Tell us a little bit about what your role is and what the association consists of.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much for having me, Lily. I really appreciate the time. Just to talk a little bit about our work at the Amhara Association of America, or AAA. AAA is an advocacy organization that was established in 2016 in Charlotte, North Carolina, mostly by first-generation Ethiopian Americans, but later it's expanded to be across North America, really. For example, myself, I'm located in Canada. But the focuses of AAA are on advocacy, education, and action. So these are a lot about human rights and political issues, justice and accountability, and sometimes humanitarian needs and issues like that. And we engage different stakeholders, such as folks in the US government, international organizations, human rights organizations, media, researchers, academics, and even the general public.
So it's a US, Canada diasporic organization that is advocating for human rights in Ethiopia, for the Amhara in particular.
Absolutely.
You use the word Amhara, but tell the audience who may not be familiar with this term, who are the Amhara in Ethiopia and what has been their role in the history of Ethiopia?
Absolutely. That's a core question. I want to kind of clarify that sometimes Amhara, that term can refer to a few things. Okay. So first and foremost, it refers to a people. It's also associated with a language, Amharic, and a place. But just to focus on the people and the language, the Amhara people are an ethno-linguistic group indigenous to Ethiopia, which is a country located in Eastern Africa, as you know. They are Amharic speakers. Amharic actually is Ethiopia's official language, so it's spoken across the country. It belongs to the Semitic family of languages. If we have some linguistic folks watching, it has a unique alphabet with over 280 characters. So it's very much its own thing. It's very unique. The Amhara people have a very rich cultural heritage with distinct types of music, traditional clothing styles and food, and so many other wonderful things. But these are people who the majority live in very underdeveloped conditions and follow a very traditional way of life, where faith systems play a very large role. So, very old ties with some of the largest religions in the world, with Christianity, Islam, Judaism. And so there's a lot of historical ties going back thousands of years. There's not really reliable census data on what the population of the Amhara looks like within Ethiopia, but some estimates range between 40 to 70 million people.
Yeah. So this is it the second largest ethnic group in Ethiopia?
Well, officially, that is the mainstream claim. Yeah. But, folks like myself like to push back on that and say, actually, there is evidence to suggest that Amharas could be the largest group in Ethiopia. And that has to do with kind of the system in place in Ethiopia, which kind of divides the country into ethnic regions. So there's an Amhara region, and that gets into what I was mentioning earlier about Amhara being a place. Yeah.
We'll get to that in a second. I think also for context for our audience, I would say the Amhara region is home to some of the major tourist sites in Ethiopia, the historic sites that a lot of foreign tourists go to see. So, 12th century rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, the Lake Tana, which has island monasteries around it, Gondar, which is this, I think used to be an empire in Ethiopia and has this castle compound, which is quite incredible. I went to see it in 2020. And also Simien Mountains is also in the Amhara region, which is a huge hiking, UNESCO World Heritage Site and a hiking spot, which is, by the way, absolutely mind-blowing. I camped there for a night and hiked. And I've been to a lot of countries and I know I'm kind of biased, but Simien Mountains is truly otherworldly. But anyways, so that's in the Amhara region. But as you said, it's not just about the Amhara region. The Amhara people live in many other parts of Ethiopia, right?
Correct. In Gondar, it's interesting. I'm sorry, I'm a history buff sometimes. So I'm compelled to insert a little thing there. And
correct me.
It's actually it's the medieval capital of Ethiopia. For Addis, Gondar was the old capital, and this was a few centuries ago.
So the Amhara are, and not just in the Amhara region,
Yes.
kind of paint a geographic picture for us of Ethiopia and where the Amhara are.
So the Amhara people inhabit areas throughout Ethiopia. There is historically, I guess, more of an Amhara heartland in the northern central parts of the country. But over the centuries, there were never any borders, right? So people were going all around the country, and there was migration patterns and wars and all of these factors that led to people kind of mixing around. And I think the Amhara definitely inhabit pretty much all parts of the country. But what makes things complicated is that in the 1990s, there was actually a new system introduced to the country, which divided the country into ethnic regional states. And so this was a controversial move that was pushed by the then ruling party, the TPLF, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and the TPLF, which represented kind of a minority group within the country, essentially imposed this system, which assigned Amharas this arbitrary homeland, or this Amhara region, which they considered, okay, you guys belong here. Wow. And then now all of a sudden, the Amharas in other parts of the country became disenfranchised. And when I say disenfranchised, we're talking about on a constitutional level, essentially branding them as not belonging to these other areas and being given names like settlers. The Amharic term is neftenya. And these have later been used to as kind of dog whistle terms to justify targeting and inciting hatred against these communities. And it's unfortunate.
Also, and they're also in Addis. They were in large numbers in Addis, but we'll come back to that. Let's get to the crux of why we're here today, and which is that we're talking about the persecution of the Amhara that has been reported in various international reports, including the Amhara Association of America, and there's the term genocide even being planted here. Now, from what I understand, genocide is a legal term that has to be determined by the UN or by the international courts, and there has to be intent and a whole of other sort of proof that you have to show to get that determination for there to be something done about it internationally. So can you kind of tell us what is happening to the Amhara, this indigenous group from Ethiopia, and what is leading your association to say it is genocide? It's
kind of this all-encompassing, really, attack on the Amhara, and it's against the people, the language, the place, and it's the Amhara genocide is actually unique in some respects because it involves multiple perpetrator groups over a long period of time, although there have sometimes been interruptions in between across various geographic areas and districts within the country. Okay. And so this term has been in use now for many years now, at least within the Amhara community. But of course, as you know, in today's global landscape, it's become this, the G word, right? So sometimes it's kind of misused in different contexts. People like to politicize it. But in our case, really what it is that this is something that probably there was very, very strong evidence for as early as the 1990s. Wow. If not before. Now I think for the purposes of this discussion, we can definitely frame it on the current war, but I felt that was important just to kind of provide context for. But we at AAA, actually, one of our major activities is human rights documentation. And so for a long time, there was this issue of the plight of Amhara people, the targeting and the human rights violations not making it to the mainstream. So not making it to the medias, to, the international agencies, the UN. And so it required organizations like ours, grassroots organizations, to step in and begin to say, hey, like this is happening with documentation. And so what does that mean? We have a team of human rights investigators based on the ground in Ethiopia, which are able to compile these reports on a regular basis. And we issue daily updates as well as weekly reports, and sometimes larger, more thematic ones that look at trends.
That's good. Very difficult to do that kind of work at a time when you're also being, your ethnic group is also being targeted. And then knowing the distances in Ethiopia, it's a huge country. And then the communication, is there open sort of, internet communication? I know that sometimes that goes away. I don't know what the challenges you face are. And also if you could speak to the ones who are believed to be responsible.
There are many challenges that come with that. And That's why, in the first place, our investigators' identities are protected. So this is not, their names are not publicly available. And I think that speaks to the environment of repression that exists in Ethiopia. Independent journalists have been rounded up and put in jail over the years. So it's really over there, the state media narrative that they want to, present as the only truth. But as we know, that has not been reliable in talking about what's been going on. And our reports actually indicate that there is a pattern of violations, of daily atrocities. We're talking about civilian massacres. We're talking about daily. Yes. There isn't a day that goes by where an Amhara person isn't killed, isn't abused. And it's not an exaggeration to say this is one of the deadliest wars going on right now that people don't know about. And, that goes into a lot of, geopolitics and all of that. But just for the purposes of this discussion, just to kind of give like a brief overview, we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of massacres in the last 2 years, which is when the Amhara war has taken place. The perpetrators are state forces at this time. These are forces of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his ruling party, the Prosperity Party. The Prosperity Party is a coalition that's really dominated by Oromo regional counterparts, so the Oromo Prosperity Party.
Is the party of Abiy Ahmed, who's Prime Minister of Ethiopia?
Yes. These abuses are carried out by the federal army, so the Ethiopian National Defense Force under command of Field Marshal Birhanu Jula, as well as regional security forces. So these can be militias, these can be what they call Adama Bittina, which roughly translates to riot dispersal police. There's also other actors as well, in some cases non-state actors such as the Oromo Liberation Army, which have targeted Amhara civilians, both within the Amhara region, but also in the neighboring Oromia region. And this has been a group that's been highly implicated in these atrocities over the period of our reporting. So within the context of this war, but also in the years before. We're talking about massacres. We're talking about mass arrests and profiling and putting people in concentration camps. We're talking about sexual and gender-based violence. And this is happening at various periods under communication blackout. And so as we were talking about challenges of reporting, there are times when telecommunications and internet are shut down. So for a period, we'll be unaware of what's happening, but we'll have a pretty good idea that something bad is going on. This could coincide sometimes with military operations. It can coincide with something that essentially the regime does not want to be exposed.
You mentioned concentration camps, and I know your association has used this word. Can you describe what you mean? These are people who are indigenous to Ethiopia, yet they're in sort of what resembles concentration camps. Can you explain what that is?
Since the start of the war, we've documented essentially arbitrary arrests, sometimes enforced disappearances. So imagine, you could be in the capital city, at home with your family, your spouse, your children, and armed men could essentially enter your home, sometimes without uniform, and drag you away from your family in front of them, sometimes beating you, and essentially, prevent you from put something over your head, transport you in the darkness of the night to an unknown location to you that's remote oftentimes. This could be in areas surrounding even the capital city. And sometimes this could be areas in Amhara region. There's been many cases of prisoners being taken to the eastern part of the country in the Afar region, which is very, very desertous. Wow, and so people are put into, there's one of these infamous detention facilities called Awash Arba. And so this is known as Ethiopia's Guantanamo. And so it's extremely hot there. The people are deprived of, essential, basic things like water, food, of course, air conditioning. So they're burning, and sometimes they're intentionally left out in the sun for the sun to inflict, burns on them. They can be tortured, beaten. If there's medical concerns, they're deprived of access to healthcare.
Are we talking about regular citizens? Are we talking about journalists, or literally what is their crime for being taken there?
Well, their crime is being Amhara, according to the state. And so initially, these patterns of very large-scale arrests started in about 2022, about May 2022. And this was kind of more politically charged. So these were people initially that were identified as being potential dissidents, like critics of the regime. They started with high-profile people. Independent journalists were seen as a large threat. Opposition figures, people that lead civil organizations, and so which crippled civil society. They could be seen as people who are online bloggers or activists. But later, this expanded to encompass anybody who is, Amhara. So this is just profiling. They could look at you, and if they feel if it's their unlucky day, they would essentially target you,
Wow.
and you would disappear for an unknown period of time.
No recourse. Wow.
With no recourse.
Okay. Thank you for painting that horrific picture for us. All of this is obviously in your reports that the Amhara Association publishes on their website and in social media. I always say that, and I know this is something both of us believe most likely, that, to understand the present, we really have to sort of look at the past, and we also have to debunk some of the myths that perhaps even some of us have believed as, Ethiopian-born folks, as well as others outside.
Mm.
And so I want to start with something I read recently that looks at the monarchy period of Ethiopia. But really, the history of Ethiopia began long before. And while we don't unfortunately have time to go through every detail here, the narrative of Amhara dominance in politics is, I think, something that runs through as a theme as we see these attacks, I guess, on the Amhara. Do you agree that this is sort of a false narrative, that the Amhara have always dominated everything in Ethiopia?
Absolutely. And it's been pinpointed to, colonial era manufactured narratives. This was things that were done around the time of right before World War II, for example. There were infamous manuscripts produced by actual Nazis and affiliates who essentially portrayed the Amhara as an obstacle to colonial interests in Africa. And I think a lot of what we're seeing today originates from seeds planted as early as that time. During this
fascist Italians, as well as the Nazi.
Actually, the first notable publication I can think of was by an Austrian actual Nazi. So this is the name was Baron Roman Prochaska, and the publication is called Abyssinia, the Powder Barrel. And so this is one of the earliest, written scripts that essentially frames the Amhara in this way. And of course, it does make mention of the monarchy. The monarchy is seen as, being predominantly Amhara, according to this individual. However, it's not true. And the framing of it actually is in response to what happened towards the end of the 19th century, which was the first attempt by colonial powers to essentially colonize Ethiopia. This was the Italians at the time. And at the time, it resulted in a war, and the Ethiopian forces under command of the emperor at the time, Menelik II, defeated them and was able to preserve Ethiopia's independence.
Battle of Adwa, which is one of the events of the 19th century that had never been seen, of an African army defeating a European power.
Absolutely. And actually, the Battle of Adwa was the last and the final battle. That was the culmination of the war. But there were a series of battles before that.
Yes, there were.
And so the colonialists were defeated. And then come World War II, there was, the rise of fascism in Italy under Mussolini. And he wanted to draw on those very nationalistic narratives as a demagogue, right? He's trying to rally support. And one of these was avenging the loss of the Italian Empire in the previous war.
The Battle of Adwa.
Yes.
The embarrassing defeat by a black army, right?
Yes.
It's really interesting. I was reading this book, I think it's called The History of Ethiopia, between 16th and 19th century, that also talks about the Battle of Adwa. And what I thought was really interesting is that the author, Bahru Zode, said that it was not just the Amhara who defeated the Italians during Adwa, that it was really a united Ethiopia that showed up and that led the country to defeat the Italians, which is really interesting, because that's not the image that gets out there. It's not the history that we hear. We always hear that it was Menelik II, but Menelik had managed to actually draw a more united Ethiopia, perhaps, than other rulers.
Yes, definitely more united than his predecessor, Yohannes, who hailed from Tigray. And I think Menelik was able to rally a very large force, which surprised the colonial power and was able to overwhelm them ultimately. And come the Second Ethiopian-Italian War, World War II, there was this narrative that emerged by these authors, these Nazis, these fascists, and essentially there was the scapegoating of the Amhara. And so they blamed the Amhara for basically their loss in the initial war, that essentially led to there was actually a brief occupation by the colonialists during the Second World War, in which they used, a bunch of illegal weapons, chemical warfare, all of these things that, while Ethiopia was embargoed from procuring arms at the time. And they essentially would distribute pamphlets incentivizing their forces and some of their colonial recruits to hunt Amhara individuals and what they called Amhara chiefs. And so that was probably the earliest form of ethnic-based targeting against Amharas. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in modern Ethiopia is kind of a continuation of some of those things that we saw as early as World War II.
There's also this ethnic federalism, which you briefly mentioned, that the Tigray People's Liberation Front, when they were in power for 30 years, they introduced that. Is it true that they also put your ethnicity on your ID card for the first time? Because I heard this. I mean, I didn't live in Ethiopia at the time, but...
Yes, essentially people have called it a system of ethnic apartheid, where your identity actually directly results in how you're treated in society. There's a system of social stratification, which during TPLF rule, which was between 1991 and 2018, so about 27 years, the TPLF was able to essentially rule as this authoritarian kind of dictatorship where ethnic Tigrayans actually had benefits. So it could be even speaking the language, it could be your identification, anything from, basic services and administrative offices to from the moment you enter the country in the airport, where there's different lineups, different lines.
Different lines for the ethnic
based
group?
on ethnicity.
No way. I didn't know
based
that.
on ethnicity. And it's to this extent that this apartheid system just kind of seamed into every aspect of society. And, it's one of these things where people think that wasn't as bad as it was, and maybe it's a thing of the past. But in 2018, when the new regime came into power under Prime Minister Abiy, that system didn't go away, but it was actually transformed. And so it went from being a system where there was this Tigrayan hegemonic kind of structure to now an Oromo hegemonic structure. And so the system wasn't reformed.
If you're Oromo now, you're in the good group, or you're benefited.
The favored. You're favored, highly favored. And as we mentioned earlier, as an Amhara, throughout both consecutive authoritarian regimes, you got the short end of the stick. And it wasn't just, marginalization and lack of rights, lack of representation. Mm-hmm. This is actually violence, targeted violence in which large numbers of people lost their lives.
And I think we need to mention that the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed actually is half Amhara.
Well, it's disputed, Lily. It's disputed because when during his campaign to gain popularity and kind of oversee the transition in 2018, there was this narrative that he, drew on his half Amhara side, which he claimed. But then on state media in Afan Oromo, he claimed that he was Oromo on both sides.
Wow.
So this, what the truth is difficult to verify, to be honest with you. But it's clear that from that time, he was part of the Oromo branch of the coalition. So he at least identified in that way. And it points to this whole ethnic federalism structure where, people kind of lean on identity as a means of gaining access to something. And in Abiy's case, it's about political acceptance and trying to sell himself as this all-encompassing figure. At the time, he was trying to demonstrate that he spoke all the major languages. He could speak Amharic or Afan Oromo, Tigrayan.
I think also because there's a significant Amhara elite in the United States, right, and among the diaspora. And so I remember when he was doing his tour here, I mean, I didn't go, but I remember it was a big deal and everyone was feeling so hopeful. And, here was somebody speaking about peace and change and uniting every Ethiopian. And especially for people like me who are in a diaspora who perhaps, don't have a day-to-day connection with our homeland, but we still care with our birthplace. And so it was kind of like, wow, I can finally go back and safely. And so I think that was probably part of the fundraising that he was doing as well, right?
If I can comment, because you raised something very interesting, I personally actually push back against the use of the term Amhara elite, just because it's actually been used as one of these
it's probably
scapegoating terms. But, traditionally, a lot of people of Amhara heritage didn't come up being raised as someone who identifies strongly with their ethnicity. Traditionally, like at least let me speak for myself and many people I've spoken to.
I think
I
perhaps
can't speak for everybody.
I could say maybe an older generation is
Yeah.
very proud to be Amhara and very, very clear that they are Amhara. I say this because my mother is from Wollo.
You know what? I'm saying the older generation, there was a tendency to be Ethiopian first.
Oh,
And
sure.
people
No, I agree with that.
identified as Ethiopian. Of course,
I
they
agree.
spoke Amharic
Absolutely.
and they were proud of where they came from, whether they were from Wedlo or Gondar or Shoa or Gojam, they would be proud of that.
I agree.
It was,
we're talking about different things, but yeah,
yeah.
I agree. And I remember growing up in that atmosphere, even
Yeah.
abroad.
Let me ask you, Lily. Let me ask you, growing up, were you ever explicitly told that you were Amhara?
No.
No, exactly. That's my point.
All of that came into the discourse kind of when the regime started changing, My parents grew up in the, during the years of Haile Selassie. So, they were there as they grew up during that time. They were young adults during that time. They went to university at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're from the old school, but so it's very sort of Ethiopian, like
Ethiopian.
Always like you're proud to be Ethiopian. And we grew up outside in West Africa, but in Ivory Coast, because of my dad's job, but it was always instilled in us that we were Ethiopian, and we were taught Amharic at home.
Exactly.
But it was never suggested that we wouldn't also learn other ethnic languages.
Oh, absolutely.
And the reason I think my first recollection of different ethnic groups is because my father is Gurage.
Mm-hmm.
When he would make calls, and back in those days, we had the rotary phones. So the dial, those old phones. And when he would call Ethiopia and talk to his family, it would be in Guraginya. And so when I was old enough to figure out that wasn't Amharic, I was like, what are you talking about? And so that's how I realized, I think, that I was half Gurage, but it was never really a big deal. And then later on, I think, after I came to the United States, and by then we were adults, heard about all of this, the TPLF, for example, the fact that, you had to put your ethnicity on your ID, and also even just meeting randomly Ethiopians here, around where I live in the United States in the East Coast, and people starting to ask me what ethnicity I am.
Yeah.
Oh, you? Yeah. And one time I had braids. Let me tell you, I had these corn, like long cornrow braids, and I walked into this taxi, and I remember him saying, "Oh, Tigray, you Tigray," and I was like, "What does it matter?" I mean,
that you're touching on something so important. A couple of things, and one of them is the reality of many Ethiopians is that there is no ethnic, purity. These are generations, centuries of intermixing, and so when you assign people an identity, what do you do if someone claims that they have ancestry in multiple things? And essentially the system, it was so regressive and so destructive, and really it was a disaster waiting to happen if you think about it.
Yeah, I guess that's the culmination of what we're seeing now.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'll tell you, to this day, it doesn't really make any difference to me whether you're Tigray or Oromo or whatever. I'll treat you the same, and I realize that's not everyone.
You know what? It's that ethnic apartheid mentality, I think it really traumatized a generation of people. And when you think about it, it was to the point where you could open state media or, all the TV channels, for example, there are state owned. So there was no independent kind of programming. And there was a channel or two that were devoted to traditional music. Yeah. And so you would open this channel, and then disproportionately they would be playing, for example, Tigraynya music, like disproportionately. And I'm not saying don't play it. I'm not saying it's not a bash against them, but it shows you the mentality where the will of kind of this minority is kind of imposed on others, whereas some people would not see their own kind of tradition kind of reflected. And it was this thing of elevating some while kind of pushing others down. And that can really, it leaves a lasting mark.
30 years. Yeah.
It leaves a lasting mark for people.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to FANO. If you can explain what FANO is. This is the group that has been pushing back against this persecution against the Amhara by the government. And who are they? I've seen them described in the media in the West as militia. They've been this maybe even rebels. Who are the FANO in Ethiopia?
So I would say they're not militias. I would also say they're not rebels. The current war, the reason why I say they're not rebels is in the current war, the FANO didn't start a rebellion. It was the Abiy regime that declared war on the Amhara people, and the FANO have been fighting in self-defense. And so that kind of brings us to what FANO is. And FANO is this traditional practice within the Amhara community of taking up arms during times of foreign invasion. And so earlier you were mentioning, for example, what was happening in the 16th century and over the years. And this is a part of the world that experienced a lot of conflict. And that kind of led to this practice of, you had to protect your land because you don't know when, an invading force will come, sometimes foreign, sometimes a neighboring empire, or whatever the case might be. And so that's what FANO is kind of on a traditional level. But now with the modern FANO movement, that's kind of changed in a way. It's kind of evolved into a self-defense force for the Amhara. And so, what makes this sometimes perplexing for outside observers is that you have the Abiy regime's army. This is one of the largest, most sophisticated armies in Africa. Mm-hmm. And so they have tanks, they have jets, they have all of this technology, they have training and, support from other Western countries and other partners selling them sophisticated technology. Yeah. And so they're fighting against this FANO. And so they're saying, why have they not crushed these FANO in a matter of weeks? How did this go on, right?
Right.
Abiy supported by a lot of countries. We're talking about the UAE. We're talking about Russia. We're talking about Iran, India, the IMF, World Bank. So he's getting billions of dollars and all types of equipment. But you have this FANO who have no foreign backing. They're not getting weapons from anything.
Where are they getting their weapons? Yeah.
When this war started, they were essentially armless. There may be some outdated rifles, but they armed themselves over time by fighting against the army. And essentially, it's been 2 years later now, and you have the FANO who have kind of self-organized. It was kind of this decentralized, structure. It's slowly consolidated, and now it's actually evolved to be administering large parts of the Amhara region. So they've actually removed the army from many parts of the region and are administering. And so it's kind of unique. It's a unique...
So like you were saying, it's been escalating the last 2 years, this persecution against the Amhara that started years ago, but has been accelerating these last 2 years. And yet, I feel like most people know about the Tigray war, what is called the Tigray War from 2020 to 22. And that was very brutal, started in Tigray and then spread to also the Amhara region and other parts. Can you tell us, how is Ethiopia coming out of this Tigray War, and how does that connect to what is happening now with another ethnic group, the Amhara?
I like to call that one the war in northern Ethiopia, just because it spanned 3 regions. So Amhara, Afar, and Tigray. And so a large part of that war was actually fought in Amhara. And I think sometimes that's left out of the conversation. And it was a very devastating war as well. For 2 years, people from all 3 regions suffered, millions of people. There were lots of atrocities. There was lots of suffering. And so the Ethiopian people didn't want war. There was no appetite for war, but there was this political development, this friction between the ruling TPLF, the previously ruling TPLF, and now the current Abiy, which are kind of two sides of the same coin in a way. And essentially, in November 2022, 2 sides came together for a peace deal, the TPLF and Abiy. This was a peace deal brokered by the international community, African Union, close cooperation with the United States. And this was signed in Pretoria, South Africa. And this peace deal at the time was criticized because people said it was exclusionary. So you have this war that involves all of these actors, but you're only bringing 2 of them to the table. So how can you expect there to be lasting peace and resolve the underlying issues if it's not inclusive of everybody?
The Amhara were excluded, and they had fought alongside the government, which is interesting.
Well, that's the mainstream narrative. But I would push back and say the Amhara fought not because they were supporting Abiy, but because they were invaded by the TPLF and the TPLF's allies, the Oromo Liberation Army. So, for example, when the FANO were fighting at that time, they were fighting in self-defense because the TPLF and OLA were invading their land and doing pretty much the same things that the army is now doing in their land. And since the deal with the Amhara war, now those other actors are fighting alongside the army. So now the sides have all shifted around. And so I think it's complicated. It's difficult to
Very
understand for people.
complicated.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And then, sometimes if people try and do their own research, I think it's difficult to find.
They land on the Western lens on things, which is always skewed to whatever
Yeah,
agenda they're serving.
there's agendas. And I
There
think
are a
for
lot of
me,
agendas, yes.
for our team, we've observed things very closely over that period since 2020. And it's clear to me at the time when the peace deal was signed, although the peace deal as a concept was welcomed, there was apprehension about this exclusion of the Amhara participation. And then sure enough, the war resumed, but this time it was just isolated to Amhara. And so for Amhara people now, you've had more than 4 years of consecutive war between the two wars.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
Absolutely. So here's something I have to ask you, or I wouldn't be doing my job. I've read, again, international organizations like Human Rights Watch and others that have made claims regarding FANO, the force that is defending the Amhara and their land. And they say that they were allegedly involved in a lot of the violence against women that took place in Tigray during that northern Ethiopia war, as you said. They claim that FANO was alleged that they took part in those rapes of Tigrayan women, which kind of goes against this, again, the purpose of what FANO is really doing that most people don't understand. So how would you respond to these line of allegation?
As a principle, me and the organization I represent condemn all violations against civilians. So if there's any allegation that needs to be investigated and the perpetrators need to be held accountable. But in this case, I think there's some very important distortion in context missing. Or there's this distortion and there's context missing. And part of it is that FANO did not enter Tigray proper. They entered territories that were actually disputed between the two regions. That's one. And
interesting.
The problem here is that when in the 1990s, when that new ethnic federalism system was imposed and these ethnic regions were created, what happened there was that areas that were historically Amhara majority districts, namely Welkait, Tagade, Satitumara, and Raya on the northern side of the map, were actually annexed by the Tigray region. And so that created a land dispute because the Tigrayans wanted to hold on to that territory for economic purposes, for geopolitical purposes. And that ended up being one of probably the factors that led to the Northern War because they wanted to continue holding on to that land. But as a result of the war that they started, unfortunately, they lost that land because at that point, the people there were very disgruntled, and those areas were actually sites of early Amhara genocide.
Wow.
And so it's interesting that they brought the claim of ethnic cleansing and all of these things, and the rape, but in my personal opinion was a smokescreen to cover up what was actually there. Because once the Amhara forces were able to take control of that area, for the first time, there was documentation emerging of what had happened, including mass grave sites, victim testimonies of people who could actually speak out. Because for residents of Welkait and Raya, for many years, they were essentially under this Tigrayan settler administration of TPLF militants that migrated there and essentially were administering them, but essentially banning them from speaking their language of Amharic, banning them from any cultural expressions of Amhara identity, and killing them. So, there was a study by the University of Gondar, and it's publicly available. I think it's probably available on Amazon. But they did an initial study, and they found that as many as probably around 70,000 Amhara civilians were killed in just the Welkait Tagade area. 70,000. And so when the war broke out, the largest civilian massacre of the Northern War was in a town called Kadra. And that was when the TPLF forces systematically killed over more than 1,500 Amhara civilians in a small town.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
When they say the ethnic cleansing, that FANO committed ethnic cleansing, they're not saying that FANO killed people. They're actually claiming that FANO forcibly displaced Tigrayans. But guess what? When the Amhara forces came, there was a large migration of TPLF militants and affiliates of their own volition because that just followed the war, the massacre. So there was a fear that there would be retaliation, and so they left because those individuals were settlers that had essentially benefited during the TPLF period. So this is the distortion that happened.
And this is why I'm also, speaking to my audience now. Thank you so much
Mhm.
for listening. I know that this is a lot. That's how complex things are, and the narratives that you don't hear from local voices and from experts like Robel, who are literally day in and day out listening to these sensitive reports of crimes against an indigenous group of Ethiopia. I mean, to me, this is kind of an indigenous people who are fighting for their survival, no different from other countries that we hear about where indigenous people are being targeted. And yet we don't hear much about it because of the importance of nuance, right? And also
Mhm.
the language, probably the language barrier, perhaps lack of interest among all of the other things that are happening in the world at the moment, probably, right, is a huge
Mhm.
challenge. And the tendency to expect crises and negative things coming out of the African continent that are unsolvable or like hopeless, painted
Mhm.
as hopeless, really is solvable.
Mhm.
And international community can certainly intervene and investigate, as you said. I was in Rwanda a couple of years ago, I think, and I was having a conversation with a Rwandan there who said that actually really surprised me. He said that they were watching Ethiopia closely
Mhm.
because they could see the signs of what happened in Rwanda before the actual full genocide happened. That they could
Yes.
see signs of that in Ethiopia, and they were very concerned and were following Ethiopian news closely.
Just on that point, the two things. Firstly, the Lemkin Institute actually went beyond a red flag alert and they issued active genocide alerts on multiple occasions, as recently as 2023.
Okay, how many Amhara are we talking about in the last 2 years alone? The part
Mhm.
that has escalated. How many Amharas have been massacred, persecuted, put in camps, targeted? Do you
Mhm.
have an average number?
This has been very challenging for us. It's something that we're striving to do to give a better idea of it. But we know that the civilian casualties over the last 2 years are beyond the thousands. So we're talking at a minimum in the tens of thousands, but possibly more. And the reason why it's so difficult, as I said, is because firstly, it's very difficult for us to have access on the ground. There's an active war going on. There's a communications blackout. So our investigators, we don't want to compromise their safety and send them into active war zones. So a lot of this information compilation is done through like phone calls and remote kind of contact with sources. And so we're trying to establish for now patterns of what the abuses look like. We know there's been hundreds of civilian massacres, drone strikes, heavy artillery strikes. And so this war is essentially it's almost being conducted as if the Abiy regime has been told by the West, do what you want. We're not going to call you out. Do whatever you want. You can abuse them however you want, and we're not going to say a thing. And unfortunately, it's been silence from the international community, and not just silence. I would say complicity. When the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are providing billions that are going to go to military spending to procure these weapons to be used against the civilians, it's not even silence, it's complicity. And so this is why this is a major war that's happening. And it's when we say it's a war and a genocide, I think there is the war going on. And it's one thing if it's combatants killing each other. But just to paint a picture, for example, you know, with kind of this insurgency style kind of combat, what happens is there's a group in a certain area that might have popularity. In this case, maybe the FANO, which have popular support.
Mm,
And they go and they attack the soldiers and they kill a bunch of soldiers, which is it's part of war, unfortunately.
right,
But
right.
what ends up happening is the soldiers, they're frustrated they can't get these guys back because they're in a jungle or something or in the mountains. So it's difficult for them to target the combatants. So what do? They go to the nearest village, and then in revenge, they start targeting the villagers. And so that's when we say it's a genocide. That's what we're talking about. And I think we have to call that out. It's not about taking a side in the war. It's about saying, hey, look, this army that's supposed to be protecting the citizens is doing the opposite. They're actually killing the citizens. They're putting them in concentration camps. They're in some cases taking people hostage.
They're using
So
drones to strike civilians randomly. We're talking about
yeah,
children and going about their business every day. Suddenly,
schools,
strike.
clinics, public gatherings, cafes, you name it, they've bombed with drones. And that has been one of the most devastating aspects of this war.
We have to mention that they're supplied by the United Arab Emirates, is what I read. The drone equipment.
The drones, Abiy's getting a lot of funding from the UAE. The drones are also coming from other places, from Iran. It's coming from China. It's coming from Turkey. So it's pretty bad.
But is it in the interest of these nations to have Ethiopia fall into a demise because the Horn of Africa is so important?
Yeah, there's geopolitical interests. I mean, the UAE has been a player in the region for a long time. As we know, they've been funding the RSF in Sudan, which has been also accused of all types of abuses. And so these players, to them, this is kind of this like chessboard. These are not human lives. It's just the strategic area to control, and they don't care.
The Nile is there. I mean, good chunk of the Nile.
Yeah.
So if I were in Addis Ababa today, would I notice what is happening around me? Would I be safe?
That's a very good question. And I would say, maybe as a message to the content creator community and the tourist community, sometimes there's a tendency for people to promote tourism in Ethiopia. And I would say at this time, when we're talking about kind of responsible tourism and being kind of conscious of the social issues, it's really important to be careful about promoting this idea that it's peaceful. Because even if you can go to the capital and there's not necessarily fighting going on there, things are happening. People are dying in the capital too. And I think
and also the displacement alone of these beautification projects that the Prime Minister has been so proud to promote, which is, I mean, when you see it, it looks absolutely incredible. But what happened for that to take place? And I think there was like mass displacement of people.
Mass displacement since at least 2023. We're talking about more than 100,000 households on the outskirts of Addis Ababa city. These are people who are rendered homeless. There's also famine in other parts of the country. And so this is a country that doesn't have food security, and where even displaced people are not getting humanitarian relief.
Yeah.
So all of this...
and I'm glad you spoke about the content creators, because I certainly have seen several YouTube videos about Addis Ababa and going to the market and all these fun things, and there's absolutely no mention of the huge struggle that the country is and crises that the country is facing right now. And that was also part of the reason why I decided to reach out to you to explain to us what is happening, so that people are aware, to kind of start wrapping up. And it's just been a lot, and it's really devastating what is happening to the Amhara people in Ethiopia. Certainly, I know that all of us listening are just beside ourselves and wanting to perhaps help and know what can be done. And I'd love to know from you, what would you like to see change, and how can that change happen? First, and then next we'll tackle sort of what we can do as everyday citizens here in the United States.
First and foremost, we'd like to see an end to the war. It's as simple as that. For civilians to stop being victimized. We need peace. Peace has been elusive, but we need peace, and we need genuine efforts towards peace. Not like these cosmetic or these disingenuous attempts by the regime for international consumption, where they say we're doing this, we're doing that. It's not truthful. As they're kind of making these statements, they're doing terrible things on the ground. We need restoration of basic services to areas under the war, restore communications, restore water, electricity, banking services. People are struggling in major cities and towns.
Right.
Yeah. People who have been internally displaced in shelters need humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, even some of the international organizations have stopped doing needs assessments in Amhara. So it's not even talking about the needs, they stopped doing the assessments. So what happens if you stop doing the assessments? Suddenly the need is not being talked about. These things need to happen. We need attention for the Amhara people. We need to stop the turning a blind eye to the suffering in this part of the world. These lives matter. These people didn't do anything to deserve this. And we need to, I think, call out the Abiy regime. The Abiy regime is an authoritarian regime that has complicit in genocide. I think we need to be able to call them out in the same way that we'd call out any other authoritarian warmongering ruling party. And it's completely inappropriate when some of the leaders in the West or other parts of the country, take photo ops with this man, because he's not leading a peaceful country and fighting terrorists or something. It's not like that. This is somebody who is killing his own people, who is extremely narcissistic, probably other problems with him as well.
Do you believe that Ethiopia is at a point of no return? How did we go from being a beacon of African independence, African union, Pan-Africanism, pride in all things African and Black to...
When I watch some of these interviews with FANO leaders, it's clear to me that, these are people who are very intelligent and who, these are people who are former professors, engineers, doctors, you name it. And some of their words, they're very inspiring. And it tells me that even among those who have arms, they're fighting for a cause, and they're fighting with some type of a vision for the future, for a harmonious and peaceful Ethiopia. And if they can kind of come forward and talk with that spirit, I also believe that the ordinary people on the ground also have that kind of a thinking. So I don't think the problem is to the point where it's, at a place of no return. I think there's hope, but I think Ethiopia is sick. I think there's a sickness, and it has to do with some of these political leaders who the Ethiopian people as disposable, essentially. And they see them as, people who can be sacrificed for their short-term, hold on power. And I think that is where we need to take a stand. And again, this comes back to, it's not just Abiy, there's a whole structural overhaul needed. This ethnic apartheid system. There shouldn't be a system where people, benefit based on their ethnicity, on their identity. It needs to be something where it's democratic. People can go into the ballots, they can vote, they can go back to debating like real political issues, not like whether it's justified to carry out genocide. They need to be talking about taxes and healthcare and all of these other things, all these other policies.
Have a decent quality of life, at least.
A decent quality of life too.
Live and to send their kids to school and to go to the doctor and get water and electricity.
Exactly. So the situation right now is not good, but I have hope that it is salvageable, but it needs a collective effort from all of us. And it starts with talking about what's happening, addressing the truth, and taking the conversation from there.
Any message to the Western media? Because I know you're going to be appearing again on future Western news, and perhaps this is your chance to say what you would like to see or what you've noticed.
The big ask from us, I think it's not a big one, is that when having conversations about Ethiopia, to make these platforms inclusive. Amhara, as we said, could be one of the largest groups or the largest group. So if you're having a conversation about Ethiopia, it doesn't make sense to exclude representation from this group, because, I think that does a disservice to the audience. I think it doesn't accurately portray the realities of what's happening. And ultimately, I think, discredits that media, that platform, when they do those types of things. And the other thing is, with this war, it deserves to be talked about. This is not just like some small minor war or some minor conflict or whatever the case is. This is a major war, one of the largest in the African continent and in the world. There's a huge civilian toll, and we need to be talking about this, because as global citizens, if we're willing to turn a blind eye to something that happens in one part of the world,
sure,
then, what are we doing? What's the point? What's the point of having the media?
That's always been my platform, sort of I'm a travel journalist, but to skip over something important that's happening in a destination is just unconscionable. But I think that there's a responsibility to even at least mention it and explain, yeah, it's great to visit. This place is incredible. But at the same time, here's what's happening to the people. And for us, audience, we can share your information. I'm definitely going to link to all of your reports in the description, and the link to the Amhara Association of America and your social media handles, so that everybody can sort of stay informed. And I guess our best way to support is to either donate and share.
That would be appreciated as well. I mean, we're volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I've been volunteering with AAA for over 4 years now. So our work is made possible through generous donations from our supporters and allies. Our team of experts on the ground are paid staff, and we can only afford to pay them through the donations. So this money will be put to good use. We do a lot of good activities. We actually produced a documentary for awareness recently.
I was so sad that I missed it because I think they had a showing in Washington, D.C., and I found out too late. I found out a day late.
Yes, we're working to bring it onto streaming platforms, but it's called We're Still Breathing. And it talks about the story of survivors of Amhara genocide in Oromia. And, it's one thing for me to sit here and talk about it, but it's another to listen to a survivor talk about their own personal experience. And I found it to be very powerful and very moving. It's a short documentary film.
By Graham.
And yes, Graham Peoples, and it was produced by AAA. So
I was trying to see it, and then I missed it. It's so sad. I hope he does another showing at some point. Any final last words to everyone?
well, thank you so much for having me, Lily. I would just say, follow AAA for updates. We're on most social media platforms: X, Facebook, YouTube, Telegram, etc. And feel free to reach out to me personally too. And you can email us at info@amharaamerica.org.
Thank you so much, Robel. Truly appreciate your presence here today, and all of the volunteer work you're doing is incredible for your country and for my birthplace. Thank you so much. And again, really praying for an end to this war. And in the meantime, we have to speak out and share. So thanks again very much. I really appreciate it.